Hi everyone, I'm Casey Vaughn, and today I'm going to be discussing police brutality and racial profiling through the eyes and framework of famous sociologist W.E. Du Bois. So, who is W.E. Du Bois? He is a famous scholar, sociologist, professor, and civil rights activist. He dedicated his life to his work researching race and race relations, and he was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. His work was really focused on how racism and prejudice was the reasoning for the social condition of African Americans at this time, and he rejected any idea or theory that provided biological or hereditary backing for slavery and the inequality of Black people, and he was heavily committed to social reform. And then this was a quote that I pulled from his famous work, The Souls of Black Folk, and it states, "He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face." This is a quote of his that I find interesting and that I think kind of lays out the theme of his work and the rest of this presentation. He's hinting at his concept of double consciousness, which I will discuss in a few minutes, but this quote is essentially saying that he wishes Black Americans would be fully accepted by society and allowed equal opportunity, and it's a metaphor for the injustices they face, like police brutality, just because they are both American and Black. In this same work, The Souls of Black Folk, he developed these three main concepts and ideas about race and racism. So the first one is this concept of the veil, and it's a metaphor for the barrier that racism has created between white people and Black people. This veil symbolizes and perpetuates systemic inequality and discrimination because it makes white citizens see Black citizens as stereotypes and not human beings. Second is this idea of the double consciousness. In his famous work, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois explained double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Because of racism and stereotypes, Black people are always having to worry about what white people are thinking of them, not just what they think of themselves. And then third is this concept of the color line, which is the barriers in society that continue to keep Black Americans as a marginalized group. White people live above this color line with unlimited opportunity and access, while Black Americans live below it, not being offered the same opportunity or chance for success. So now that we are familiar with W.E. Du Bois and some of his work, let's break down the social issue, which is police brutality and racial profiling. What are both of these things, and why is it such a big issue? So according to the Police Brutality Center, police brutality is unwarranted acts of force or violence towards citizens by police officers, and racial profiling is the process in which law enforcement decides to target or focus their attention on people of color based on their race rather than evidence or any display of unlawful behavior. And then for the significance, police brutality and racial profiling is a pressing issue in our society that continues to disproportionately affect racial minorities and Black communities. So looking back on our history, we can kind of see where these specific racial biases and injustices stem from. According to the National Association of Colored People, it all began with slave patrols and slave patrol officers. And these were officers who basically would chase down slaves that had escaped from where they were working at the time. And then they would normally they were usually very violent when they did find the slaves. And then next is the Industrial Revolution and Civil Rights era. There were a lot of protests during these times for more rights for Black Americans. And these protests would often get very violent, and officers would usually use violence to stop these protests. And then next is Jim Crow laws and segregations. If there were Black people that were not adhering to certain segregation regulations, police officers would either remove them from a space or take them to jail, and that also got very violent. And then with housing laws, white communities and Black communities became very segregated, and this is where the criminalization of Black communities really began, and there's just a lot more patrol officers in Black communities than there was in white communities. So today, police brutality and racial profiling persist, reflecting long-standing racial inequality that has been built into our social institutions. Here's some data I collected from the Public Policy Institute in California's report on racial disparities in traffic stops. So more than 26% of police shooting victims are Black Americans, and Black Californians are a little over 2 times more likely to be searched by a police officer for reasonable suspicion when stopped for a traffic violation in California. And you can kind of just see the difference between Black Californians and white Californians in these little graphs that I included on the right-hand side. And then next, I pulled this graph from the Prison Policy Initiative website, and it yet again shows a significant gap between white people and Black people when it comes to treatment by law enforcement. Black people are overwhelmingly more likely to experience force and threats from law enforcement as opposed to white people, and that is the same with the Hispanic population. So recently, the social issue has been more publicized and spread on the media. Anger has spread among communities everywhere with the deaths of Breonna Taylor, who was an unarmed Black woman that was shot to death in her home by police, and then George Floyd and Eric Garner, who were 2 unarmed Black men who died at the hands of police officers kneeling on their necks. Their deaths were videotaped and spread across the media. This anger and pain felt from these losses sparked the Black Lives Matter movement during COVID times, and protests occurred all over the country to fight for the injustices that the Black community has been facing. And many people noticed that there was little to no reform, and many police officers have not been held accountable for their crimes. So why have we yet to see significant change? Du Bois' racial frameworks can help us look at how police brutality and racial profiling are yet another form of institutionalized racism that is maintaining the oppression of Black communities and further reinforcing their status as a marginalized group. So, in an article on the differences in judgments about police violence between Black and white people that was published by the Journal of Social Psychology, the authors explain Black Americans scored higher than white Americans on blame of the police officer, belief that the victim was racially profiled, and belief that white people were reacting strongly because they were tired of injustice. White Americans reported greater beliefs that people were reacting strongly because they were playing the race card. In a separate article discussing the responses to George Floyd's death on Facebook, that was published by the Social Sciences Journal, the authors explain a strong sense of being white as well as negative stereotypes about Black individuals predicts low empathy for Black people subject to excessive force by police. So the veil is clear in the contrast between how white Americans and Black Americans see events of racial profiling or police brutality, which is a contributing factor to why it still persists today. Because of white people's privilege and positive experiences with law enforcement, white people fail to acknowledge the inequality Black Americans experience when it comes to protection by law enforcement. And because of this, they revert to only acknowledging certain stereotypes that have been socially constructed, and they fail to see Black victims of police brutality as victims. So next, I'm going to connect contemporary evidence to Du Bois' concept of the color line. In an article analyzing the injustices Black communities faced after the destruction of Hurricane Katrina, Professor Tyra Whitaker from North Carolina State explains, great fear spread across Caucasian communities in southeast Louisiana post-Katrina. After observing the media's portrayal of African Americans looting in the streets and breaking into stores to obtain food, Caucasian citizens began to fear for their lives. Gun shops were beginning to sell out of ammunition. And then she also states, within the first week after Hurricane Katrina, a total of 10 African Americans were shot by members of the NOPD, which surpassed the number of civilians wounded or killed annually by the department. These quotes connect directly to the color line because they describe the different the completely different social perceptions and attitudes on each side of this color line. White people who are getting supplies for their families being photographed are published as family gathering supplies, but when a black family does it, they're displayed as looters on the media. As we can see, these labels have dangerous repercussions, and they manifest themselves in how our social institutions treat Black Americans. These biases and racialized perceptions are deeply ingrained into our social institutions, and they uphold inequality. So next is his concept of double consciousness. In an article published by the Political Studies Association on second-class citizenship of Black Americans, Dr. Carpin explains, more relevantly, racialized charged incidents involving harassment, police brutality, or shootings of young Black men may also shape racial parental styles and further increase distrust in law enforcement agencies. For instance, a study found that the murder of Trayvon Martin led many African American parents to engage in emotional processing with their children and advise them on how to react if they found themselves in a similar situation. And then another one was, second, the belief that racial profiling is conducted arbitrarily may also amplify feelings of powerlessness, since it suggests that there is nothing that a non-white citizen can do or refrain from doing in order to minimize the likelihood of being profiled. So because of racial profiling and police brutality, Black Americans, especially Black men, have to constantly be worried about being seen as a threat or dangerous. Police brutality has made it so that Black families have to teach their children how to avoid officers or have a plan of what to do and say if they ever encounter an officer. And this can really harm an individual's sense of self, having to feel that others see you as a threat just because of the color of your skin, and there's nothing that you can do to change this false narrative is really harming to a person's sense of self, especially a young child. And then lastly, I found this quote that I think can tie into all three of these concepts. In an article titled, "If They Gunned Me Down and Criming While White," Professor Jackson from the University of Oklahoma explains, many who had seen the photo that was latent with negative connotations began to refer to Michael Brown as a criminal and a thug, especially after it was discovered that Brown had been involved with petty theft shortly before the shooting occurred. These kinds of negative representations of victims of color often serve to strip them of their status as victims, influencing some to believe that these individuals had it coming. So white Americans may not recognize that this label is false and unfair and is racial bias, and when victims are blamed for something that happened to them, it invalidates their struggle and, like she said, takes away their label of victim. Each time bias like this is spread, yet another Black American is falsely criminalized, it's reinforcing these false stereotypes and perceptions that cause Black Americans to not have full and equal protection under the law. So these are a few possible solutions that people have talked about before: diversity and bias training, activism, defunding the police, criminal justice reform, things like that. Maybe even enforcing use of the body cameras at all times and releasing data. But would Du Bois be satisfied with these solutions? The truth is he would not. He would note how it provides temporary, insufficient, and artificial fixes, and it doesn't really address the racism and bias that has been embedded into our social institutions because of his frameworks like the color line, veil, and double consciousness. And all these things don't really hold these institutions accountable for fixing these deeply embedded racial biases. And he would say that the society needs to be retaught of how to think about race and how to get rid of racism. And he was really for reform and activism, but there needs to be reform in all of our institutions, and it needs to be heavy for it to work. All of Du Bois' frameworks show us how racism is deeply embedded in our social institutions, perpetuating this inequality and social issue of police brutality and racial profiling. And Du Bois would explain that the only way to stop police brutality and racial profiling is to break down these deeply embedded racial biases and reteach all institutions that maintain them, like law enforcement. And here are my references. Thank you.